Okay, blood. We've looked at the heart, we've looked at the blood vessels. Now we have to just take a short little look at what blood actually is. So blood is a fluid, right? It's obviously a fluid. And it's made up of three sort of basic, well, actually, I guess I could say four basic parts, okay? So there's what we call the plasma, which is the liquid part of blood. It's sort of like the watery part. I'm going to put the liquid part. And since it's the liquidy part, it has in it, the plasma has in it dissolved molecules. Molecules and ions. So for example, sugar, your blood sugar, right? Sugars, salts, things like potassium, that's transported around in your blood, calcium, those are all just floating around inside, etc. Sodium, all those things are all floating around inside the plasma, right? And so you'll see things like when we talk about ions, remember from chemistry, that's, things like Ca2 plus ions floating in there, sodium plus ions, potassium ions. They're dissolved, so they've been pulled apart from their partners, right? And the partners are also floating around in there as well. There's chloride, negative chloride ions, and sulfate ions, and carbonate ions, all kinds of ions. And they're all floating around in the plasma. In fact, those are floating around just about all in every liquidy part of your body. And what your body can do is it can use cell membranes to move those around in very clever ways. Push them here, push them there, and in doing so, you can change where the positives and negatives go, and you can create what we call gradients, which then can cause all kinds of interesting things to happen. So those are very important parts of our body. And of course, they have to be regulated at a certain level. And so the blood has to carry them to and from places where they're needed. They can be offloaded from the blood into tissues through the capillaries, like we talked about in the last video. Or if places where there's too much of them, they can be loaded into the blood and carried to places like the kidney, which can eliminate them. So the blood, again, is the taxi service that delivers these things all around, whether they're on their way to the body cells to be uploaded where they're needed, or whether they're coming from body cells because they're extra and we want to get rid of them. And so where they end up, if we want to get rid of them, is when the blood flows past the kidney, it diverts its way through the kidney, and all these things come out, and they, of course, then get squirted into other tubes as urine, and then they find their way out of the body. So it's quite complicated and quite interesting. And in your grade 11 class, you'll learn, and your grade 12 class, you'll learn even more about that. So that's the liquidy part. It's a straw-colored liquid, color of straw or hay. If you watch medical TV shows or things where they talk about, they'll say, push 2 units of plasma. So if somebody's lost a lot of blood, right, and they need to get the volume back up quickly, they might give them plasma, which they've taken from other people. The only place you can get it is by donors, right? And we'll talk about all that stuff shortly, once we get all the pieces down pat. Now, in that liquid, there are some cells. There are what we call the cell components of blood, right? There are actually living cells. So the cell components are floating around in the plasma, and there's basically 2 kinds. There are what we call the red blood cells, because they look red when you look at them, right? They're also called erythrocytes, but we won't worry about that. We'll just call them red blood cells for today. And their main role is to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from cells. That's pretty much all they do. In fact, these cells have become so specialized that they have lost almost everything inside of them. Almost everything. They don't even have a nucleus. They don't need it because they're just basically transport cells. Now, because of that, They don't live very long. These cells are formed in the bone marrow, right? They're formed by mitosis. Remember mitosis? But a special kind of mitosis that forms these cells, because they can't make their own. They're pretty much empty. There's no mechanisms inside of them. Very few things to do anything. So they're formed by bone marrow cells. And they're highly specialized to do this transporting of CO2 and O2, and that's pretty much all they do. They don't live long. They don't live long. Okay? They fall apart and degenerate after a matter of, well, I'm going to say a day or two, maybe 3 days. Your blood cells are constantly being replaced because they don't have the mechanisms to stay alive. Because all they do, it's like taking someone and saying, okay, you're going to be the messenger, and you're going to deliver messages. You're no longer going to eat. You're no longer going to poop. You're no longer going to breathe. You're just going to run your little arse off until you get to where you're going. And they're going to do this and burn themselves out, and they're going to die. And you're like, okay, get the next messenger. Make a new one. Burn them out until they die. And that's the process of red blood cells. That's the job they do. Okay? So, transport CO. Now, how they do this, of course, is with a molecule. They contain a very special molecule called, I'm going to put lots of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. You'll sometimes see this with an A in it, but we won't worry about that. Hemoglobin, which is a complex molecule that allows the CO2 and O2 can attach to this molecule. Okay? They can attach to this molecule. And that's how it carries stuff around. Interestingly enough, other molecules can also attach to this. And the nice thing about carbon dioxide and oxygen is they can attach and they can let go quite easily. So they can be picked up and dropped off very easily all over the body. But other molecules can stick to the hemoglobin and they stay stuck. Carbon monoxide is very close to carbon dioxide, right? Carbon monoxide, CO, is dangerous to us because it sticks to hemoglobin too, but it never lets go. So it would be like having a bunch of taxis in a city, and there were a few people who were just kind of rude and got in the taxis and never got out. That would mean nobody else could take a taxi, and the whole system would be crippled. So when we breathe carbon monoxide, it sticks to our hemoglobin, never lets go, and now we can't transport oxygen or carbon dioxide anymore, and we can very quickly die if we don't get some kind of treatment, right? Or at least some fresh air. So that's one of the issues carbon monoxide has. It's a sticker as well, but it's a bad sticker that never lets go. And there are other molecules that can stick to this. And I realize I spelled it wrong. I must have been thinking about that A. I wrote hemoglobin. This is a G here, so I better fix that right off the bat. Going too fast again. Hemoglobin with a G. Globin, that's what it's called. Okay, and so that's how the red blood cells work. That's their primary job. The other cell component don't look red, so we'll go down here. These are the white blood cells. And there are many different types of them. Leukocytes and all kinds of different fancy names for them. Lots of different kinds. But for an introductory course, we just want to learn the difference between these two. These cells do not carry oxygen. They float around in the bloodstream, and their primary purpose is to fight foreign invaders. So things that have made their way into the bloodstream that don't belong. Bacteria, viruses, they'll clean up dead cells. And by clean up, what I mean is they work in a very amoeba-like fashion where they will swarm all over something, right? So, for instance, let me give you an example. They tend to have these weird sort of amoeba-like shapes, and if they come across a little germ, they will swallow that germ, sort of using, remember we talked about that phagocytosis where they extend around, they bring it into here, they bring it into their cell, they use enzymes to break it apart and take all of its pieces, and then we can reuse those pieces for whatever we want. If it's something larger, like if it's a big thing, these, like maybe it's a, some large foreign object, or maybe it's a grain of pollen that you're allergic to or something. What they do is they all swarm around it. You get 100 of them all swarming all over this object. Maybe it's a sliver of wood that you stuck in your finger. They'll attack anything. They will swarm all over, and then they use their enzymes to break down this piece. If they can, they'll break it down, and eliminate it into little pieces of molecules and that you can reuse. Now, of course, there are some things they can't break down. So if you get some things stuck in your body, you need a surgeon to help get them out, right? When you get a sliver, right, in your skin, if you leave it there, it'll get infected, which means you'll see pus coming out of it, that white goo. Well, the white goo is essentially a whole bunch of these white blood cells that have all been brought there by the bloodstream to try to break down whatever's stuck in there, that piece of wood. And they're pretty amazing. They can kill and break down a lot of things to protect us. Primarily, though, they're circulating through the bloodstream and they're fighting these guys. Okay? And they're getting rid of them. And they can tell who's who by looking at the cell membranes. Remember how we said they have those funny little molecules, glycoproteins and glycolipids and that stick out of the membrane. And the patterns of those can be used to recognize who belongs and who doesn't. So they'll clean up dead cells. They do all kinds of sort of cleanup jobs. Those are the two main components of blood that are cells. And then there is one more component of blood that's not a cell. It's basically a protein. So the last component is what we call a platelet. Platelets. Platelets are a protein. And this protein, its job is to help blood get clotted. So what they do is they form blood clots. Essentially, the platelets, if you have here's a blood vessel and it's ruptured, it's cut open by something, and blood is leaking out. Well, these platelets will swarm to this area. They will collect here, and they will mishmash together and form like a grid that blocks off. And then the grid they make means that all the blood cells will get all stuck against the grid. And then, of course, these blood cells will die, right? And as they die, they form a big blob of drying up, dead, clotting blood. And that helps to seal the wound until the cells in the these cells along here that are making up this blood vessel can grow. They can, by mitosis, and they can grow and heal the wound. So a blood clot is a way of protecting you from bleeding to death. We want to have blood clots when we're cut open. We don't want to have blood clots when we're not. So blood clots can also be a danger because if you have some kind of trauma, right? The problem with blood clots is this. Let's say this trauma happened, you banged your head really hard in a concussion, and you damaged some cells, and you got this clot. Well, normally what happens is when the blood vessel is fixing itself, the clot then begins to dissolve. It's taken away. It falls apart. White blood cells will come, clean up the mess, and everything goes back to normal. But sometimes the whole clot can break off and start traveling down the bloodstream before you've had a chance to get rid of it. And the clot then can travel to very critical places like blood vessels in the brain or places in the heart. And they can block blood flow, which blocks oxygen, which causes cells to die, which is huge problems. So when you get a stroke, it's usually caused by a blood clot that has found its way to your brain and is blocking some part of your blood vessels that are feeding your brain. Okay? Not a good thing. So we don't want clots, that to happen. And of course, there's a whole biochemistry about clots. It's not just platelets and blood cells. There are clotting factors and other molecules, so it's very complicated. I'm just giving you the overall view here. And of course, some people have a condition called hemophilia, where they don't make enough of these proteins, or they're missing one of the other parts of this puzzle, this complicated biochemical puzzle, and their blood won't form clots. So if they get a small cut, it just keeps bleeding and bleeding and bleeding, and it won't stop. So usually they have to artificially add clotting molecules to help the blood clot so that they can heal. Hemophilia is a disease where you tend to bleed for a very long time, every time you get even a little nick or cut. And so that could be serious. So there are the components of blood. The platelets for clotting. The two types of cells, white blood cells for fighting off invaders, red blood cells for carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide, and of course the liquid that everything floats around in, which also is full of all kinds of sugars and salts dissolved in it. All right? Now, while we're talking about blood and blood cells, we can also talk about something called blood types. You probably have heard of blood types, and you might know that there's what we call type A, type B, type AB, and type O. Well, here's what that means. It basically means that your blood cells have a certain license plate that identifies who they are. If we look at the surface of a cell, okay, if we look at the surface of so here's a red blood cell, and we zoom in like this, and we blow it up, and we look at the membrane of that red blood cell. So, okay, I'm going to draw this very fast. These are the phospholipid bilayer of the membrane, right? Very fast. And remember that sticking out of this were all kinds of little tiny molecules that stick out of the top of the membrane. Not just, so these are like little protein, glycoprotein, glycolipids branching off. There's also little proteins stuck in, some of them are on one side, some of them go all the way through, right? The peripheral and the integral proteins. But the peripheral ones, there's patterns. And so what happens is there's different patterns. These patterns are things that can be read and used to identify cells. Okay? One of the molecules or types of molecules that these patterns make, they're called antigens. Antigens. And they're identifiers. And it turns out that with people, red blood cells come in different shapes and sizes, and they have different antigens. So if you have a blood cell that has what we call the type A antigens on it, if you have the right pattern, we call them little type A, then your blood cell has little A type antigens all around it. And that means your body can read that and say, oh yeah, that belongs to us, we're type A. Okay? That's what type A blood means. Type B blood means that your body has little type B antigens all around it. On your cells, there are little molecules that are the pattern that we call B. Some people have blood cells that have both, because basically it's just what your genes tell your body to make. When you're building blood cells, your genes tell the body, or the bone marrow, for instance, where to put the proteins and what proteins to put, so they get made with the same patterns. Some people have A's and B's all around on their blood cells. ABs all around. And so we call them type AB. And then some people, like me for instance, we have none. We don't have any of these particular, we have lots of molecules, lots of these molecules and things, but none of them, the particular patterns that match the antigens. So we are type O, no antigens at all. Now the problem is, if you have type A blood and somebody puts type B blood into your bloodstream, when the blood cells bump together, the A's and the B antigens will interact and cause the blood to stick and clot. because they're not meant to be in the same place. Now, what's funny is if you have the A and the B, it won't clot. So it all depends on what you've got. So if you have this one, that means I could put A blood in your body, and your body would say, yeah, that's fine, I get it. We could also put B blood in your body, and they'd say, oh yeah, we recognize the B too, because you're used to seeing both. And so both of those types of blood would be okay in your body. But if you had only type A blood, and somebody puts type B blood into your body from a donor, then you'd have a problem. They wouldn't recognize the B, and you'd have a clotting issue. Okay? If you have type O blood, you have no antigens, which is interesting, which means type O blood could be given to this person with type AB, and because there are no license plate identifiers, it would be like, well, I guess they're okay, right? They don't realize that it's from a different body. You could give it to this person and this person. So people who have type O blood, their blood can be given to anyone without a problem. Now, usually the doctor tries to match your blood, but in an emergency, type O blood could be given to anyone because it doesn't cause any problems, because there doesn't have any of these identifier antigens. But if you're type AB, you're lucky because you can get anybody's blood. So type O is sometimes called the universal donor because you can give to everyone. Type AB is the universal recipient because you can take anyone's blood. But type A or type B alone, they have a less option. They have to have either type O or type A given to them if they're type A, this person here. And if they're type B, they have to get type B or type O. And that's basically how that works. And you'll learn more about that when you get into grade 11 biology as well. Now, somebody asked a question about the plus and the minus. There's another molecule pattern on here. It's called the RH factor. There are literally hundreds of thousands of different patterns on a cell. It's crazy, because remember how small they are. So the RH factor is another molecule that you may or may not have. If you have it, you're called positive, and if you don't have it, you're called negative. So on your blood cells, right? So here's a person, so for me, I have type O blood, but I also have the positive RH. So I'm called O positive. There's also O negative if you don't have it. You can be AB positive or AB negative, depending on whether you have this additional little recognizable pattern of molecules on your cells. And so that's another blood identifier that doctors have to watch to match up so there are no problems. And that's how blood typing actually works. It's basically just describing the membranes of your blood cells and what's on there, what molecules are on there. All right, so that's blood typing. Now, let's talk about, we've covered the heart, we've covered all of the other blood vessels, and now we've covered what happens with blood. Let's just talk for a few minutes about some of the conditions and issues that we can have. Actually, you know what? I think it'd be better if we did it in a separate video because we've already gone about 25 minutes. So we'll stop this and we'll do a separate one for that.